Let's talk about all these new lockdown measures, what's going on with universities, what's going on in terms of the battles in Parliament, as we have up to 100 Tory MPs now set to vote for what's called the Brady Amendment to the Coronavirus Act. That would basically force ministers to give Parliament a vote on any future measures they want to bring in. Well, let's talk to one of those MPs, and that is David Davis, Conservative MP, former Brexit Secretary, of course, and one of the co-signatories on that Brady Amendment. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
How important is it to you, and why, that MPs, that Parliament gets to have a say on new lockdown measures?
Oh, massively important. I mean, the big piece of legislation, which we are now sort of revisiting, came up in March. And at that point, I said, this is ridiculous. You can't have this unamended for 2 years, which was the original proposal. And it's important for a lot of reasons. It's important to hold the government to account, but it's also important to improve the quality of the government's decision making. I mean, the last 6 months has demonstrated in terms that not having to come to the House, not having to your civil servants prepare for every possible option and question, not having to respond to members of the House of Commons saying, well, what about Mrs. Miggins in my constituency whose elderly parent doesn't fit in this characteristic? Or my small businesses, or somebody with disabled children, all the little tiny bits of very, very important detail that attach to any serious piece of legislation, it's all been missed. And so the government's made loads of mistakes.
And this is it. We've seen, constantly rules are brought in, which we discover since, like the rule of 6, the 10 p.m. curfew on bars, restaurants and pubs, which apparently have had no input from SAGE, supposedly the science body advising the government on whether it would have any effect. We've seen what's happened with universities, childcare rules, where the grandparents would be allowed to be involved or not, or all these other issues. There doesn't seem to have been anyone in government going, oh, what about this? And is that basically the role of MPs? In which case, this is not necessarily about stopping a lot of these measures coming in. It's about making them more sensible and, I suppose, workable.
Well, it's about 2 or 3 things. Firstly, it's about making sure they are based on evidence. I fear, because we are hearing all these things, the 10 o'clock rule, the rule of 6 and so on, appear to have absolutely no empirical data behind them, no scientific data behind them. But what you read in the newspapers are things like this. I mean, this is this morning's paper. A senior government source said the nation and the party wasn't ready for us to go any further last week. There wasn't a wide enough understanding of how substantial a second wave could be. What he's talking about is opinion polls. And if what's happening is the government is essentially running the so-called scientific policy by opinion poll and focus group, then Parliament would have found that out months ago if it had been properly challenged. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as I say, is getting it right. And the third thing, if the government hasn't got it right, it's stopping it doing it. The difficulty we've had in this country, we had a huge lockdown, and I think we're probably got amongst the worst outcome in the world in terms of reduction of disease. There was very little reduction of disease from the last lockdown. There might have been some, but it wasn't much. And there was huge economic impact. And so that's the worst of all worlds. And what we're trying to do is get the most disease impact and the minimum economic impact, the minimum impact on your daily lives. And that's what Parliament would have delivered.
There is a very big debate going on in the country, we know, in Parliament and indeed, well, particularly in the Conservative Party at the moment, and a lot of us in the media, about whether or not the lockdown measures actually end up not just costing the livelihoods of people, but the lives. But the government's own officials have now drawn up a document that emerged this weekend showing that they expect 75,000 lives to be lost as a result of lockdown, in terms of people not seeking medical treatment from the NHS, having delayed cancer treatment and the like, suicide, and long-term health impacts of people losing their jobs. We know mass unemployment has a major impact on people's health and their lives. And yet we've lost 42,000 lives to COVID, and often vast majority of those being people who were in their very, very late stages of life anyway, whether they're through elderly, to their old age or other illnesses. Has the government made the right trade-off here? And do you think the government is in danger of continuing to make trade-offs which perhaps long-term are going to cost more lives than they will save?
Well, the best test of this is to look at what other countries have done. And so you look at someone like Germany, which has done a very good job. And this is one of the problems of this. I don't think the government's sort of looking sideways at what's happening elsewhere. And take the lockdown. I mean, you've had these regional lockdowns in the northeast of England, pretty much all of Greater Manchester and so on, and compare them with what happens in Germany. When Germany has a lockdown, it's one village. It can be one block of flats, and even then they had a court case reducing the size of lockdown. But it's very, very tough. So on one occasion, they actually had a lockdown of a block of flats, and they surrounded the block of flats with policemen until they got it all sorted out. Whereas we have a lockdown for Greater Manchester. If you have a lockdown for 7 million people or whatever it was, then some people are going to break the lockdown. So it's not actually going to work very effectively. Okay. And that's my concern, that the practicalities, the lessons that other countries could teach us have not been learned. And again, if we brought it to Parliament, people would say this,
Okay,
but you've got a tiny little group of people.
We're going to have to move on. I'm going to take a lot of this up with the Health Minister, Helen Wheatley. We're going to talk to you in just one moment. Just finally and briefly, if you would, Brexit talks resume for the 57th millionth time tomorrow between Lord David Frost on our side and Michel Barnier on the EU side. There's a lot of talk now that there is hope of a deal about to be made. How hopeful are you?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be boring and repeat what I say on your program every time. The last 3 weeks matters more than the first 3 years. They were never going to budge until the last minute, and until we got a bit tough with them. We've been too soft with them for far too long. I think David Frost has played a blinder, frankly. I think he's done very well. I don't think the government handled the sort of breaking international law stuff terribly cleverly, but that's by the by. The truth is they had to toughen up the approach. The more tough we are, the more grim, the bigger the screams from Brussels, the more likely we are to get a deal. And so at the moment, I think it's actually quite likely. Well, I've always thought it's quite likely we'll get a deal. I put it sort of 60-40, 70-30 in favour of a deal, a workable deal before the end of the year.
David Davis, as always, thank you very much indeed for joining us, former Brexit Secretary, Conservative MP there.